This is work that I'm going to be doing with Niels Tufel and Rupsha Banerjee, but there's an entire sort of research group that have been working on IBLI for a long time, and this work is really building on all of that work. So this index-based livestock insurance product that I'll be talking about, it has been around for quite some time. It first launched in 2010, and when it launched in northern Kenya at that point, it launched with a sort of a large RCT that was set up to look at the impacts of the product and also the factors related with demand and those sorts of things. And then in Ethiopia, the same thing happened. So in 2012, it launched there with an RCT as well. And so there was a lot of learning that took place around this product sort of in the following 5-6 years from this RCT. And so there are quite a few papers out there that have looked at this. I think thinking back to some of what Michael said, it fits really good with the intention of this project specifically. So the existing literature out there is all related to these RCTs at the pilot level, really. And those ended around 2015, and this product has continued to scale since then. And so now it's 2020. And the idea is to use sort of the same research team and many of the same research techniques to go back and look at how does this product fared 5 years later, sort of in the commercial domain, because it's been operating still, it's been scaling, but through these scalings, it's always the commercial providers that are providing it. There's research taking place, but most of the existing research has been around sort of improving the sales agent structure and the like, and it hasn't returned back to these sort of fundamental questions about what are the impacts of this product now that it's scaling, who's buying it, who isn't buying it. And so this project that I'll be talking about today is really going to be focusing on those, and it's looking back now that this product has scaled, do we see the same types of outcomes that we saw during the piloting phase? So before jumping into it, I'll talk a little bit about pastoralism. There's an estimated 50 million pastoralists in sub-Saharan Africa. The map on the right shows in purple the pastoral areas, and you can see it's a wide variety of areas. There's the ICAE region, the Sahel, also South Africa. So this is there's many differences amongst these groups, of course. We're just kind of lump them together when we talk about pastoralists. And we want to think about households that are really relying on extensive rangelands for their income, as well as to maintain a large stock of their wealth, because these livestock represent a huge portion of their wealth. A really simple way of thinking about why we care about droughts is that droughts cause low forage availability and water availability. It reduces income at the household because they become less productive. So a large portion of their income, pastoralist income, is milk or calves, offtake of animals. It also deteriorates their productive asset. So this asset, livestock, can die, of course, but even if they're not dying, if you want to sell them, if you want to slaughter them for meat, they're much less valuable when they're emaciated, for example. Catastrophic income and herd loss has certainly been identified as a major cause of poverty in the area. And those of you that are familiar with the literature around poverty traps, a lot of that literature is coming out of pastoral areas because there's such a direct relationship between environmental conditions, income and production at the household, and then household wealth. Of course, households are responding by coping. So I don't want to act as though something like droughts are something new. This has always been the case. And in fact, when people think about pastoralists, we usually think about households that are moving around, tracking after rangelands. So this is, of course, the case. But when there are droughts, tracking after those existing rangelands, looking for water, looking for forage, it becomes more challenging. And then you have to cope in other ways as well. It takes more labor, for example, to move these animals further away. So in northern Kenya, during drought, people might move their animals as far as Ethiopia or down towards Mount Kenya, for example. So this takes more labor. So you see households are pulling children from school, for example. It leaves less income at the household because often when they're moving the animals far out into the bush, they just sort of leave the house, most of the kids and sort of the older people at home. They have to fend for themselves because they no longer have income from milk. And of course, often you're sort of pushing yourself into areas that you wouldn't like to go into because they're conflict zones, for example. The figure on the left is from a household survey we did in 2016, 2017. And here we're just calling up households that we knew were on a roster of people that had purchased insurance before. And we're asking them, how are you responding to this drought? How are you coping with this drought? So I think many of us can remember that this is one of the worst droughts in the last 20, 30 years in the ICAE region, at least. What we're seeing is there's a lot of activity around trying to get food, right? So people are buying food on credit, food aid, they're relying on their neighbors. And then the second set of activities is around their livestock, of course. They're buying food and forage for water, or they're selling or slaughtering their animals, vaccination services. And then we do see this sort of pulling kids from school to help them support herding practices, which is even worse in these areas where a lot of food aid is directed through schools. So the idea of the index-based livestock insurance product is, of course, just to mitigate the impact of drought on households. And for those of you that aren't familiar with the area or with index insurance generally, you might wonder, why don't we use a sort of a standard insurance product where people have losses, they lose their livestock, and then we pay them for those livestock? And the real issue is effectively there's no data, or it's too expensive. You can think of those as kind of being the same thing. So to provide somebody with a standard and conventional insurance product, you have to be able to create a risk profile for them so you know how much premiums to charge them. And those data aren't there. And then you have to be able to verify losses. You have to be able to verify why the loss occurred. Is this the right animal that was insured? And these animals are really far out. So during a drought, you might have to track really far out to just verify that this animal actually died. So it's cost prohibitive. So an alternative form of insurance is to provide people with indemnity payouts when something sort of on average happened in their area. In this case, we're using a signal. It's an E-modus NDVI signal that's measuring the greenness on the ground. The wonderful thing about this is it's, first of all, it's globally available all the way back to 2002. And so we can look at what did rangeland conditions look like in this area in this season normally. We can generate a distribution of how the rangeland areas normally look like in this month or over this rainy season in your area. And then we can then identify anomalies and make payouts around those anomalies. At this point, because the rainy seasons, most of the forage accumulation, of course, takes place over the rainy seasons. And after the rains stop, the forage degrades at a pretty predictable rate. The payouts are actually made sort of in anticipation of this degradation. And so we watch how the forage accumulates over the rainy season, and if it doesn't accumulate very much, then a payout can be made in anticipation of a forage scarcity sort of during the dry seasons. This is the result of sort of a research for development program within IBLI, where we collaborated with a bunch of basically remote sensing scientists that help us improve the product. In all of this, the policies are all commercially sold. So there's local insurance companies that are carrying these policies. The maps on the right, so on the top, it shows Kenya sort of in the middle there, and all the red little zones are the index units that are currently live, meaning that there's index insurance, there's IBLI available in these units now. So there's a portion of it that's in Ethiopia that's kind of on the top, and most of that are basically the arid and semi-arid regions of Kenya. And this figure explains sort of the process of developing an index. Basically, you accumulate over space, you accumulate over time, you develop an anomaly index, and then you can construct a policy on that. Since it launched in 2010, it's been scaling. So it's scaled across northern Kenya, as I mentioned, Ethiopia. The State Department of Livestock in Kenya started using it as part of its social protection programming. Currently, it purchases insurance on behalf of 18,000 households. So it buys insurance from the commercial entity to targeted households, sort of like a cash transfer program, but instead it's an insurance transfer program. WFP is beginning to use it in its programming in Ethiopia and now in Zambia. There's pilots scheduled, and there's also been a lot of interest from AFDB, World Bank, and FCDO, of course. They've commissioned a series of feasibility reports from ILRI across the Sahel and ICAE regions, basically to help countries. The idea is that these reports could help countries understand if an IBLI or a drought risk financing tool like IBLI could be useful for the pastoral areas in their country. So of course, it's not relevant for all areas, sometimes just because of the seasonality of the area, it's not very relevant. Other times because drought risk might not be a big issue for households. The idea is that some of these countries, in theory, they have now a report that can tell them if this is a valuable tool for them and could potentially move forward. And finally, ILRI worked with Africa Risk Capacity, which is a sovereign level insurance product provider, I should say, to help them develop their product tuned to pastoral areas. So they already had a product that was available for African countries, but it was tuned to cropping areas. So all of the ARC product is very similar to the IBLI product, actually. It just uses similar indices and works very much the same way. So it's all to say the findings from the pilots are really what have driven some of the scaling. People are excited about the original findings. which I'll mention now. And this has led, this led to State Department of Livestock integrating this into its products. This led to continued funding by World Bank and AFDB to continue, helping the product scale. So some of these findings that we have, I mentioned that there's the original RCTs, and this is all of the findings that I've listed here from those original RCTs. We see that there's, of course, payouts during drought help households, help them cope in ways that we think are better in some ways, or avoid some of the detrimental coping strategies. And maybe, or at least as important, we see that there's changes to production strategies, which we would hope have sort of longer term effects. So households now have insurance coverage for drought, so they can change their herding strategies a little bit. At the welfare level, certainly there's some payoffs there that we can see. And there's two concerns that people have often when they think about index insurance for pastoralists. So I mentioned them here. Number one is we know that there's informal risk pooling taking place in these areas. And there's a lot of concern that something like a formal insurance product could undermine these informal relationships. And there's no evidence of that. There's two papers that have looked at this. And then the second question is, there's some concern that people often say, these droughts act as sort of a natural mechanism for reducing the pressure on the rangeland. So basically killing cows is, I guess the argument is that killing cows is like not the worst thing in the world, because then there's not too many cows. And if there's too many cows, they degrade the rangelands. So, I mean, I understand the argument, or I understand the question at least. There has been some examination of this in Kenya and Ethiopia. The results are mixed, and in neither case have they been very large. But once again, this is from the piloting work. And so, once something goes to scale, something that looks small could maybe become more important. And I'll mention that there is another SPIA program that is actually looking specifically at this question. So they're looking at the impacts of IBLI sort of at the landscape scale, its impacts on rangeland health. So that's pretty exciting. So now for this project specifically that I'll be talking about, there's two research questions. What are the dynamics of adoption, disadoption of IBLI? And the second is, what are the long-term impacts of early IBLI adoption? So the first one is, I think, is really interesting, and it's somewhat unique. There are a lot of research papers out there looking at demand for or factors related to uptake of insurance, agriculture insurance, index insurance out there. But those are all at the household level. So the questions there is like, what characteristics in the household drive uptake? Or it's occasionally they're at the contract level saying, if we reduce price to people, increase uptake. And of course, the answer for that is always yes. But what this question is going to be looking at is sort of at the broader scale, what's impacting dynamic uptake, adoption, or disadoption. To do this, I guess I'll just mention it here. We're creating a really unique data set looking at uptake in the index unit. So we're using administrative data instead of household data. So what we've done is we've gone back to the insurance firms that were collecting data from the beginning. We've collected all of their administrative data for all of Kenya and Ethiopia where IBLI has been available. Again, the figure on the bottom left is all the
Is it me, or Nathan, have you frozen? Karen, can you give me?
Yeah, it's
this for me, so sure.
Nathan is back.
Did I dropped off?
Nathan, yes, you dropped off for just, yeah, so you might want to just back up for just 10, 15 seconds or so.
Okay, I'll just start over on the slide. Does that seem about reasonable?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
Okay. So I was saying we're developing what I believe to be a very unique data set, and this is at the administrative unit. The amount of coverage there is, and I don't think it's not so unique, because as far as the idea of collecting data at the administrative unit, many studies have done this. I think it's unique because of how long-term and how many data points we have. I should say that. There are many other studies that have, a pilot that's run for 2 or 3 years, and there's a few index units. But in this case, we have a product that's been running for 10 years now, and at every season, so twice a year, there's sales in 113 index units. Every year now, we're getting another 200 some observations. The figure again on the left is Kenya and Ethiopia with the index units in red, and the figures on the right are the number of tropical livestock units that are insured in each index unit. So you can see sort of at the beginning, there's no sales, and then there's the Marsabit pilot, and then we can see it sort of scale out over time. The other data that we'll be using is we're developing a calendar of potentially important events. So our question are, we'll have ideas that maybe this shift in the contract made a difference in how much people purchased, or when the premiums changed, how much did people purchase, or when a new insurance company came in, how much did people purchase? What are the impacts of these things like promotional activities? We can track some of those things. We have some documentation when the insurance company sort of went out and brought the director of the insurance company to ECOLO, for example, and did a huge promotional activity. Does that have any impact on insurance? The payouts, these sorts of things. The empirical strategy is pretty straightforward. Our outcomes that we're interested in are total policies, the ratio of population with coverage, or the ratio of livestock with coverage in an index unit. And we have the different types of events that I've mentioned before. And we'll just see where we get with that. This is mostly a descriptive activity, honestly. So I mean, part of the activity is just bringing together the data and learning about how this thing is diffused over time. But there are some relationships that we can learn about that are really important. So number one, does the contract matter? There's a lot of sort of theoretical evidence and then some empirical evidence that this change to contract really improved the value of the product. So do we see is that reflected in demand of people? What are the impacts of these large public investments such as CLIP on the commercial market? There's been a strong argument that when the government came in and basically subsidized the insurance product by purchasing 18,000 policies, that this should really strengthen the commercial market. But at the same time, we see from the dynamics, what we see at the insurance firm level, a lot of firms really stopped investing in outreach and they started investing in making sure that they got those 18,000 policies. So it could support the product, the commercial product, or it could undermine it. Do early rains cause adverse selection? Like this is a really relevant question for insurance firms because they could use conditional pricing. The sales window opens right before the rainy season and it's supposed to close right as the rains come. But sometimes early rains happen during the sales window. So of course people are, I'm guessing, they get to observe the rain, they might be less likely to purchase insurance when they see it's already raining. It's going to be a good season. Some of the issues we face with this are our variables of interest are often perfectly correlated. There's an insurance firm that developed a Sharia compliant version, which is demanded for by pastoralists before it arrives. So people are asking, is there a Sharia compliant version? Company developed one, launched it, is selling it. That'd be really interesting to look at. Unfortunately, that same company has never sold a non-Sharia compliant version and there's no other company. So it's just perfectly correlated with the company, which since there's only 4 companies, we have to expect that there's some sort of company impact. And then of course, there's many issues related to this sort of 2 ways fixed effects approach that we'll have to deal with. Fortunately, there's a whole bunch of literature that's come out over the last year or two that we can draw on.
So Nathan, it's really fascinating stuff, but I do need you to maybe speed up a bit.
Okay, I have 3 slides.
Okay, thanks.
Wonderful. So the second question is about early IBLI adoption. So there was an RCT, as I mentioned, that had run through 2015, and so we went back and collected the 7th round survey, and we're basically just going to draw on the existing randomization and respondent self-reported purchases to look at the impacts. The outcomes we'll look at, we'll just draw on the existing literature and look at impacts that were sensitive to IBLI in the past. So we mimic the earlier surveys, so we have those variables again. And we'll look at the impact of this early IBLI exposure on current outcomes. We use the coupons as instrumental variables because we assume that IBLI purchases are endogenous. So this raises the question, so if you think through what we're doing, we're asking what were the impacts of purchases in 2010 to 2013 on outcomes in 2020. And the question, of course, comes to mind is how can we, why would we imagine that these purchases could impact us? It's a good question. We can imagine that there's sort of these dynamic impacts. So that you purchased it, there was the changes in production that we saw empirically we saw in 2015. That this could change the household trajectory in such a way that we can observe now. The other option is that indirectly you purchased it early on, 2012. That made you learn more about the product, and so you purchased it again further down the road, and then these now impact current outcomes. As mentioned, there's other interesting opportunities with this data. So I think a big appeal of this SPHERE project has been that we're developing and contributing to the public data set. So we have this administrative data on purchases. And as I mentioned, there's another project looking at the impact of purchases on rangeland health. And then there's a whole host of questions we can ask of using this longitudinal survey that's now ranging from 2009 to 2020. I can end there. Thanks a lot. And here's our contact information. We're welcome any questions, comments, discussion. Back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Nathan. I would request any questions that you have for both these presenters, or indeed for the first presenter. If you could post them on the Q&A, then we'll have a couple of minutes for the speakers to respond, or at least get back to you once they know what your questions are. I'll just keep it open for a minute or two. So maybe I can actually start with Nathan. I mean, to what extent are you able to match the administrative data with the pilot data? I mean, what's the sort of correlation between the way the administrative data are collected and the quality of that administrative data? Because it seems to me an important part of the story of getting to a large scale. Can you say a little bit about that?
Certainly. I think there's sort of two parts of that question. First of all, collecting the administrative data at all has been a pretty big challenge. There's some insurance companies that sold the product and stopped since then, who they had never had even digital records of the insurance product. So this is sort of driving around and finding people in their house and asking for their old receipts, like the old insurance agents, and then writing them down and digitizing them and structuring them. Fortunately, people started digitizing pretty quickly. So around 2012, 13, things become digital. The second part of the question, and I think probably the more important one, is to what extent can we match the administrative data to the actual household survey data explicitly, or the survey respondents? And unfortunately, this is really challenging. In some cases we can match, but the problem is we never know how many we're missing. And this is for a variety of reasons, in part because in some cases people were required to have IDs to purchase. And so a lot of times people would purchase on behalf of somebody else. So I might, I don't have an ID, but I'll give you the money and you purchase for me. And the insurance agent would even facilitate that. So the insurance agent you might find is sort of like, the insurance agent might be listed as having 7 or 8 policies. And then, the insurance agent themselves in a different book, they're like, this policy is for this person, this policy is for this person. So the insurance agent could use their ID or their M-Pesa account or something like that for the purchase. And so when we go back and match, maybe we can match some of them. The problem is we never know how much we're missing. And I have other projects that we've spent more time and care trying to match, and we see that our miss rate is just, using just people's names and IDs, our miss rate is above 50%. And so it makes it almost impossible for us to really sort of empirically use that data. Thank you.